Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Keith Ruiter, educator, researcher, and avid gamer. Welcome to History Check, where we dive deep into practical tips for infusing real-world historical authenticity into your tabletop role-playing games. Now today we're kicking off a new series that taps into Viking Age history in order to supercharge your D&D characters. We'll add a dash of historical flavor, deepen your storytelling possibilities, and most importantly, amp up the fun. Most of the tips and suggestions that I'm going to offer here can be directly useful for other TTRPGs, but we're using D&D as a jumping off point. And we're going to start with the Barbarian class. It's not just first alphabetically, but it's also the quintessential choice for a Viking-inspired character. The class as we know it today draws heavily from popular perceptions of Vikings, especially Berserkers, or Berserks as they're probably more accurately called. But here's the twist. Those perceptions are a bit outdated. Like stuck in the early 20th century, sort of outdated. Our understandings of Viking Age peoples, including Berserks, has evolved significantly since then. So our goal today is to really just bring you up to speed with some of the latest knowledge, give you some more options to shape your Barbarian characters. I'm going to start by exploring the Barbarian class itself, offer some historical context and insights that might be relevant to the characters that you may want to play, point you to some sources of inspiration, and then I'm going to provide tips for conceptualizing and creating 3 distinct character types. One which is rooted more in historical accuracy, another which blends history and fantasy a little bit, and a third which leans very heavily into the fantastical. My goal here is not to walk you through strategies on how to make your characters as S-tier as possible. Instead, it's really all about how we can add more flavor and fun to the characters that we play. And if you find this video helpful, please take a minute to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because your support really fuels the growth of this channel, and we're just immensely grateful for it. So Barbarians, they're beefy, brawny brawlers, big muscles, big anger issues, the class with the biggest hit die because, well, you're gonna need it when you're constantly getting hit. Barbarians are designed to get up front fast, soak up as much damage as possible, and then just hit things really, really hard. Their defining feature, of course, is this frenzied rage, which grants damage resistances, attack bonuses, and advantage on strength checks and saving throws. But while some people can play really compelling barbarians, a long-standing criticism of the class is that barbs are boring, that they lack utility, and role-playing someone who is persistently on the verge of a roid rage incident can just be really difficult and destabilizing for both parties and GMs alike. Real-world history can be an incredibly powerful tool for addressing some of these problems and helping you to design barbarians that enrich everyone's experience at the games table and that are also just a lot of fun to play both inside and outside combat encounters. But to get deeper characters, though, we really need to turn to some deeper topics. And it's essential to kind of address these if we're going to responsibly integrate real history into our gaming experiences. So let's start by tracing the history of the barbarian class itself. Now, Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons & Dragons, credited authors like Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, and Fritz Leiber, the creator of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, as kind of key inspirations for the class when it was first released in the 1980s. But here's where it gets intriguing. Both Howard and Leiber drew inspiration from medieval and Northern European history, so we're not doing anything weird here. The Barbarian, from its inception, has always been engaged with the history of the Viking Age. However, historical knowledge, just like any other kind of knowledge, has evolved over time. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars were often exploring history from a sort of reflective stance on these European empires of their own day, seeking justifications for and precedents of that imperialism in places like the early medieval past. To this end, people like the Vikings were often depicted as a sort of barbaric force that hindered the progress of civilization, which was often perceived to be the primary goal of these kind of great kings of old. Now, if this feels a bit uncomfortable or reductive to have whole groups of people reduced to a sort of destabilizing historical force, that's because it should be. And the discipline of history has significantly moved on from this position, but it's this perceived clash between civilization and barbarism which so colored the scholarship of the 19th and 20th centuries, and which authors like Howard and Leiber were responding to in their fiction, indirectly shaping the barbarian class that we now have. Howard in particular held a long-running opinion that it was barbarism, not civilization, that was the natural order of the human species, and he even famously held a lengthy argument about it with H.P. Lovecraft, of all people, over a series of letters. Now, I think we can see some clear aspects of this belief woven throughout the class description that we have today. The description is rooted in a sort of rejection of civilization and an embracing of an animalistic, predatory, savage, tribalistic sort of nature. Read in a certain way, the barbarian class description can be seen as a crude caricature of indigenous or tribal societies and has been highlighted as actually quite off-putting for some players and GMs. Now, I want to stress that this isn't a critique of barbarian players or class designers. It's about recognizing how history impacts the games we play. Because unfortunately, this class description is also a result of reductive and, in this case, overtly racist historical and anthropological scholarship of indigenous societies in the 19th and 20th centuries too. Here too, historians have continued to refine the state of knowledge, but these changes haven't always caught up with the game. Those of you who have some experience of playing hard-to-control, Hulk smash-style Barbs may already understand this, but the reality is that a character like a D&D Barbarian would be wildly problematic in most societies, including indigenous societies, as well as those of Viking Age Scandinavians. And this is because these groups are not semi-animalistic rejections of society, where might makes right and only the strong survive. They're actually complex and sophisticated societies, often governed by fit-for-purpose customary legal orders, possessed of developed means for fostering relationality and social stability, and a general respect for consensus building and compromise. Now, to the credit of 5th edition designers, some of this deeper complexity is alluded to in some places of the class description. But, and this is just my personal opinion, I do think that some parts of the description are still a bit dicey at times. Now, this doesn't mean that you should take your barbarian character concepts, chuck them in the bin, and just move on to another class. Instead, I think this actually makes the barbarian a perfect example of how some updated real-world Viking Age history can really help us to just play better characters and have more fun doing it. So let's shift gears and turn to some medieval history for some clues on how to do this. For this discussion, I'm going to start with Berserks, but I'll also incorporate some discussion of other barbarian paths too. Let's start with our sources. Medieval Icelandic sagas have a fair few Berserks in them. Some of these are indeed associated with a sort of animalistic frenzy. They tend to be big, strong, and not terribly intelligent. So what do we need to change? Well, we should probably change quite a lot if we look at the context of these characters. This is because the vast majority of the Berserks we encounter in sagas are actually stock characters. They are flat, cliched antagonists designed to complicate the lives of the more richly rendered saga protagonists. They're actually really just boring NPCs, but the sagas themselves are not straightforward historical sources. They blend history with creativity and fantasy. So we need to look closely at the characters that we encounter here. In the case of most Berserks, they're not characters you typically want to embody in your tabletop adventures. These figures are often outcasts, and not the fun, edgy kind. They're on the outs of their societies because of their violent and predatory behaviors. Their violence is usually directed inward, into the society, and for medieval people, this is very transgressive. Berserks don't fit in medieval societies because they are typically antisocial, avaricious, and individualistic. They're depicted as killers, bandits, and even sexual predators, and so to put it bluntly, playing these Berserks is neither advisable nor appropriate. However, some Berserks from the sagas do lend themselves better to D&D sorts of characters. These characters are still ambiguous. There's no rage-fueled rapscallions with hearts of gold in these sorts of stories. Characters that are barbarian-esque in the sagas tend to be tolerated in certain social contexts, but are typically viewed as problems, not heroes, anti-heroes at best. In general, medieval Icelandic literature does not look kindly on people who let their emotions rule them, especially in violent pursuits. So if you're thinking about a Viking-inspired barbarian, you'll probably want to build in some of that tension and complexity. And that's a good thing because it gives a ton of opportunity for character arcs and growth. For example, there are a number of Berserks in these sources who are members of elite warrior groups, especially those surrounding certain chieftains and kings. They are still highly ambiguous characters because of their antisocial tendency towards violent overreactions, but they're kept in line by their employers who provide for them. These saga characters are often little more than useful attack dogs, kind of kept on tight leashes. But this can actually be a helpful premise for character creation for a few reasons. First, it can give your character some pre-built relationships to flesh out. In this scenario, you're part of a warrior retinue. How did you come to enter this noble service? How do you get on with the rest of the group? Do you have close friends or rivals? Are you all from the same region, or is this a diverse ragtag group from all over with interesting connections? Now, I'm not the biggest fan of using militaristic elements like this as the basis for characters, but for barbarians, this can be a good first step towards starting to make them a little more relational and a little more interesting. A second opportunity for character development in this scenario is that it can provide a justification for why the adventuring party has come together in the way that they have. If you're in the employ of a minor noble, maybe some of the other PCs are part of this orbit too. Work with your GM and be flexible with each other as you set up a backstory that makes sense here. But this doesn't have to be the only option. Maybe you fall in with the rest of the PCs while undertaking an errand for your employer, and you start working with them as your purposes start to line up. Have a think about why you've been sent on this errand in the first place. Are you a valued fixer and enforcer for your employer? Have you been sent on a wild goose chase or some sort of impossible mission to punish a transgression of yours? Given your anger issues, do you have a handler who kind of keeps you in line? And make sure you're talking with your GM as well about what might be going on while you're away on this errand. There's some opportunity for intrigue here, which is great because barbarians just aren't exactly known for intrigue. Finally, this scenario gives you a few potential points of conflict and friction. How do you feel about your employment arrangement? Is this the first place that you felt at home, but that's soon going to change for some reason? Is it all too good to be true and something sinister is going on beneath the surface? Do you chafe at the yoke of your employer, but kind of grudgingly accept their patronage, knowing that there's really nowhere else for you to go? How do the locals feel about this noble style of rulership? Is rebellion brewing? As an enforcer in this retinue, do you have moral qualms about the things that you're being asked to do? Think carefully about how these sources of conflict may drive your barbarian and the rage that they have. And that's a helpful first step, but I think we can go further in making a more history-inspired barb. And to do so, I want to introduce you to Egill Skallagrímsson, or Egill, the son of Skallagrim. Now, if you caught our Viking Age masterclass on giving your characters Viking-inspired names, note that there's no badass nickname for Egill here. Not everyone gets a nickname. But his dad's name is literally Skallagrim, and that's a joke about his early balding. So that gives you an idea about how nicknames work here. Now, Egill isn't a berserker himself, but he's a great source of inspiration for anyone who may want to find more interesting ways to play a barbarian in D&D. Born in the 10th century, Egill is known for his fierce temper and immense strength. Sound familiar? But here's the twist. He's also known for his poetic and legal prowess and his fierce loyalty and close working relationships with a small group of friends, patrons, and family members. Egill's saga recounts his exploits as a Viking raider, a warrior, and a poet. He participates in courtly intrigue and battles throughout Scandinavia and beyond, and he earns this fearsome reputation for his ferocity in combat, and even serves in the retinue of the King of England. His prowess as a poet is equally legendary, composing verses of both praise and vitriol that are regularly heralded as some of the most beautiful and complex in the Old Norse language. We teach them all the time. He also has a deep knowledge of runes, purportedly maintains a close personal relationship with the god Odin, projectile vomits at feasts in order to dishonor his enemies, and saves sick children. This is no stock NPC. This is a complicated and detailed PC that we can take some notes from. So for starters, Egill is a character of rich emotional sensitivity, complexity, and depth. Is he angry a lot? You bet. But he also has a keen sense of justice. He loves harder than he hates. And everything from poetry to feasting is a weapon in his arsenal as he navigates a life of fame, fortune, loss, family complexity, and intrigue. And against all odds, and in spite of his aggressive nature, he finds a way to hang up his adventuring hat and retire in his old age. integrating back into rural agrarian Icelandic community life. He's an interesting reminder that barbarians, and especially barbarians taking the path of the Berserker, don't have to particularly like the path they walk. Egill's emotions get him in a lot of trouble, and he's acutely aware of it. Remember that personal internal conflict can be a great way for making a more three-dimensional character, and barbarians can be at their most intriguing when they struggle to contain their emotional outbursts. It's also totally okay to play a barbarian with a half-decent intelligence or charisma score who has interests beyond hitting things. Egill is a virtuoso with poetry. He has interests in law, he appears to speak at least one language beyond Old Norse, and has knowledge of runes and medicine. Your barbarian characters will be a lot deeper and more complex, and outside of combat will be a lot more fun for you and everyone else at the table if you play less of a stock character. Furthermore, the path of the Berserker doesn't have to be one that's entirely defined by rage in the traditional sense. Instead, it might be a lot more interesting, real, and enriching to play your barbarian as highly emotional, where a diversity of human emotions can be used to sharpen the connection between your body and your mind, allowing you to enter this battle frenzy. For a more realistic Viking-inspired barbarian build, I would recommend really looking at Egill closely to see the way that he weaves like an impish humor into some of his actions, how love or a sense of justice drives some of his violent undertakings, and how the most meaningful moments of rage in the saga actually correlate to the profound sadness he experiences at the loss of his family members and his friends. Frenzy doesn't always have to be the result of anger, and this more realistic build has tons of opportunity for building a rich character with meaningful relationships. And don't forget, if you're looking to get pretty close to real-world history here, your Viking-inspired barbarians should not be wielding hammers or two-handed swords. These really weren't much of a thing in the Viking Age. Even swords should be limited for low-level characters unless they are the beneficiaries of some sort of noble patronage. Swords are expensive. Big axes, pole arms, axe shield, spear shield, and in rare cases, sword and shield combos are definitely the way to go. And for flavor and nods to history, I would recommend leaning into the barbarians' unarmored defense. But what about more fantastical barbarian builds? For something that's a mix of Viking Age realism and fantasy, I'd recommend the Path of Ancestral Guardians. There's a really cool and growing body of evidence for Viking Age ancestor worship. This includes a variety of archaeological and textual evidence which suggests that the living carried on deep, complex relationships with the dead, including regularly visiting the grave sites of relatives, sometimes entering grave mounds to retrieve items or interact with the dead in some way, and even some examples of bones being incorporated into the fabric of houses. There's also some suggestion that certain feasts were intended to honor the ancestors of the community in some way. Now, interestingly, some of the best known examples from the sagas suggest that the spirits of female ancestors were the ones who were thought to be especially likely to continue to interact with the living. So for a slightly more fantastical Viking-inspired barbarian build, I would recommend that your character has a close affinity to their ancestor spirits, maybe spending so much time visiting graves that they have kind of withdrawn from wider society themselves, rather than being ostracized for a more traditional barbarian tendency of hitting things too hard too often. I'd also suggest tweaking the flavor elements of the Path of Ancestral Guardians to better reflect the feminine nature of these ancestor spirits. And I'll be honest, a frenzied barbarian flanked by a host of spectral, disapproving aunties is going to be a lot more unnerving than the spectral warriors described in the stock description. For this build, you might want to think more about how your character began to take an interest in these ancestral spirits in the first place. Was this the result of careful study and experimentation? Or did something tragic happen, leading the spirits to reveal themselves to you? Are the spirits a sense of comfort to you? Or are they unnerving, spiteful, or even horrifying? What drives them to continue to seek out the spirits? Are you a ritual specialist in your community, serving as a bridge between the living and the dead? What responsibilities or challenges does that come with? Similar again to the more realistic build we already discussed, I don't think this barbarian's rage should be anger-fueled either. In this case, perhaps, something more along the lines of an ecstatic trance, which allows for more natural communication with these spirits, would be more fitting. Now, these light touches can really add some depth to how you play your barbarian character and incorporate a good number of opportunities for fantastical storytelling too, while keeping things very Viking-flavored. Now, what if you want to really lean into the fantasy elements? I think the Path of the Totem Warrior works well here with some specific tweaks. First, totems or dodems are a pretty sacred part of certain indigenous cultures. So instead of unceremoniously playing with something sacred, I'm going to call this the Path of the Fylgja. This works on a few levels, so let's unpack them. First, what is a Fylgja? Based on the evidence of Old Norse literature, a Fylgja appears to be a spirit or a supernatural being, usually in the form of an animal, that accompanies a person throughout their life and is associated in some way with their fate. Now, there doesn't have to be some sort of direct connection between the person and the animal that is the form of their Fylgja, and some Fylgja are actually not animals at all, but we're going for fantastical here, so let's lean in. On the other hand, berserks in general are also sometimes associated with shape changing into certain animals, especially wolves, dogs, and bears. And there's some interesting archaeological evidence that suggests that the literary idea of a berserk may have come from animal-inspired elite warrior groups from the late Iron Age, an earlier period, who appear to have dressed in animal skins in specific contexts. If we combine some of these elements together and let our imaginations run wild a bit, pun intended, the Path of the Fylgja can work great for some more speculative or fantastical barbarian builds, with some extra Viking flavor. I don't think there's much need to tweak the mechanics of this primal path, but reshaping the storytelling behind it opens some great opportunities for you to elevate your gaming experience. For example, if Fylgja are associated with fate and can follow someone through their whole lives, when did your character first notice their Fylgja? Have they always been there, or is it something new? Fylgja are often associated with dreams and nightmares. Do these affect your character? And are there repercussions to them? Does your Fylgja seem tied to a lucky or an unlucky fate? Given this fatalistic association, choosing to take a bear trait at 3rd level, for example, should imply that you intend to take bear traits at level 6 and 14 too. But if you decide not to, are there consequences? Does choosing the trait of another animal in later levels affect your fate or upset your Fylgja? These can be really interesting opportunities for richer storytelling, and especially when working in dialogue with your GM, can add some great flavor and side quest potential for your gaming experiences. Remember, character creation isn't just about stats and abilities or the story that you alone want to tell. It's about weaving your characters seamlessly into the fabric of the wider narrative. Collaborating with your GM in this process ensures that your character fits perfectly into the world that they've crafted, creating unforgettable adventures for everyone at the table. So there you have it. 3 different builds, giving you a whole host of ideas for how to play and build deeper, more developed Viking-inspired barbarians. If you have further ideas, or you want to tell us about your barbs, let us know in the comments below. If you found this helpful and you want to know more, we're going to be doing similar videos for all the core classes of D&D 5th edition. And we're also developing a more detailed video about Viking Age societies and how you can lean on their history to conceptualize more interesting character backgrounds too. Make sure you subscribed and have clicked the notification bell so that you know exactly when these are going to be released. And feel free to put requests for what you want to see in the comments. We've got links in the description below, not just our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links if you're feeling generous, but also a link to a whole doctoral dissertation on Berserks, available for free through the University of Nottingham. Thanks for watching, liking our videos, and sharing them with your friends. It's a huge help and will ensure that we get more free, high-quality historical information to a wider audience. Thanks again. See you soon.